Welcome to the Smart Nonsense Podcast, where we talk about entrepreneurship, self-development, and challenging norms. Today, it's episode 64, and by we, I mean I, because I kicked Belky right off the guest portion of this podcast. I am talking with someone deep in the world of persuasive speaking. This person has over 100 trial cases under their belt as a lawyer. They also are a coach of one of the best mock trial law school teams in the country, and they just released a fantastic course on exactly this topic, performative speaking. This person is Robbie Crabtree, and it's someone that I've looked up to on Twitter. He's crushing it right now, but is super friendly, responsive, DMing. He's willing to get on calls. I love him. We talk about everything. His journey with public speaking, how he's improved over the years, grown confident. His method, which is performative speaking, and we talk a lot about it because it's unique. It's a different way of becoming a more persuasive person. And then we tackle some other questions like how to be a persuasive communicator in the online Zoom world. This is a long one. It's about 2 hours. So check out the chapters, and in the description, if it's on YouTube, watch this on YouTube, we have the timestamps as well. So you'll be able to jump through in case you want to see any specific nuggets. But it's a fantastic thing if you watch it all through. You can find Robbie on Twitter at Robbie Crab. He also has a website, robbiecrab.com. There he has an email. You can sign up for that. I recommend it. He also is just friendly on Twitter, so follow him there. I'm excited. I'm excited for you to listen. I think there might be a part 2 because there's so much that I learned. But let's jump into it. This is episode 64 with Robbie Crabtree. Can we go back to maybe the start of you growing up? Were you always someone who's just confident, good with public speaking, kind of thinking about this law path in life?
Sure. So if we're really going back that far, so I've always been a confident kid. I was an athlete growing up. I was a kid who went to elementary school and took my basketball every single day. I was the captain of one of the 2 teams. We kind of formed a rivalry, me and another kid. We each kind of had our team every day at recess and would play, and that was just always who I was. But in terms of the speaking stuff, no, that hasn't always been my thing. So when I was younger, I was much more shy. I originally had a little bit of a stutter and a little bit of a lisp when I was growing up, which meant there was obviously a little bit of anxiety anytime it came to talking just because of those things. However, I worked through those and kind of started to develop my own voice. And I think really when public speaking took off for me was when I went to high school. And that was kind of the moment that I realized, oh, this is something I enjoy. This is something I'm good at. And then it's just been developing ever since. So I can't say it's always been there. There have been some of those traits that translate really well, but it has not always been just my thing. I was not that kid who just got up and gave a big presentation all the time. Like I did enjoy doing plays and all those sort of things, but that was just because I was competitive. That wasn't because I necessarily enjoyed being in public. I was just like, who's the main character of this play when you're in elementary school? Oh, it's this person. I want to be that person. That's always been my makeup.
It's funny. I don't know if I had the same confidence as you growing up, but I was kind of confident. I played a lot of sports. That was my life too. But public speaking, I didn't realize I just got nervous and hated it until I gave a few speeches in middle school. But it's interesting because when, say, I'd be playing a sport and I was like a captain or running things, maybe it's the adrenaline, but I wouldn't feel nervous and I'd feel like a leader then. But then when, you have the time to think and you don't have that energy, I wouldn't be the same. Kind of like on stage too. I could go up on stage and kind of perform, but maybe when I had too much thought in my head, it just wouldn't happen. Was that like, do you notice that with people? Like, I guess I don't want to get too close to the performative speaking aspect, but it kind of reminds me of listening to media or whatever to get yourself in that zone, kind of mimicking like the adrenaline or just get the mentality right and different. Am I off base there, or is that something that kind of helps?
No, so I completely understand what you're saying. And this really boils down to some people, when the lights turn on, that helps them get into that mindset of, I can overcome this because it's just that moment. Whereas other people have the exact opposite feeling. When the lights come on, they kind of fade away. The example I love to use is in any sport, right? We're talking about sports. There's always going to be players on the team who want the ball to take the game winning shot at the buzzer. And there's always going to be people who don't want the ball and who want to either pass it to somebody else or want to be on the sidelines or don't even want to be in the game at all. They just want to be a spectator. And so each person is really different. It's not unusual what you're saying for somebody to say, oh, the lights are on, they're shining, it's time to go. That is a very common thing, but it's also very common the other way, whereas people crumble when the lights turn on. So it just really depends for each individual how that affects them.
You ever hear of the psychological effect, like when you're confident in something? So say my sport was hockey primarily, but say it's basketball or baseball. Like if you're confident in that sport, you're great at it. When you have fans and an audience, you perform better. Versus if you're not as confident, maybe not as good of a player, you add that audience, it just magnifies whatever your underlying skill, relative skill is.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Maybe that's it. I don't mean to go into this discovery process for myself, but you're already kind of bringing these new ideas up in my mind. But sports, that takes you to college, and you said was it baseball that was your sport in college, or were you playing basketball also at that time?
So I played baseball on our college team. I would play basketball in the off season with our college team to practice with them because basketball really was a sport I loved. I just happened to be better at baseball because there's not a ton of 6'2" white guys having a ton of success in basketball. Like, what was I? I wasn't going to be a point guard. I wasn't quick enough for that. I was more of a shooter, and maybe there was something there. But I quickly realized the better bet for me is to play baseball, which I was much better at. So that's kind of the path I went down. And when I was in college, that's what I played. And I played mostly first base and outfield. And just, I mean, I, again, was always that person that wanted to be on the field, wanted to be at bat with the game on the line. I wanted every big moment, every big play. It's one of those things that is interesting to look back on and realize how big of an effect that college sports and sports in general have had on my life and how they really kind of push me towards working with other people, especially who also come from that similar background, because they just understand so much of what goes into that, where it's a level of personal responsibility, but at the same time, a level of teamwork. And they understand hierarchies and they understand how to work together and how to build something that is both good in the short term and in the long term. So there's just so much value in that experience that I continue to look back on really fondly and say that had an incredible influence in my life.
I think with teams in general, I was talking to my roommate because he played hockey growing up, but he played in this Czech like development team, and they all spoke Czech, and so he spoke English and couldn't talk to them, and missed such a big aspect of team sports and just kind of the leadership, camaraderie, stuff like that. That I guess we were lucky enough to have and kind of grow up that way. I was also listening. I don't know if you listen to a lot of podcasts, but Jocko Willink and Johnny Kim is his name. One of my favorite podcasts all time. I just listened to this morning, but it talks about the SEAL teams, and how tight knit everything is. And I think there's just a lot of different skills that builds. In terms of yourself, like what do you think are some of the big takeaways that team sports had for you? Was it confidence? Was it just how to socialize well?
Man, there's so many. This could be an entire hour
Right,
and a
it's a
half
podcast
long
just about that.
conversation because here's the thing. Like I said, it teaches you personal responsibility and also teamwork, which I say because if you think about baseball, which was my sport, right? If you have the best teamwork, the best chemistry in the world, but each batter goes up there and strikes out because they're not prepared to actually hit. You're not scoring any runs. You can't win the game. So team chemistry doesn't matter in that instance. On the flip side, if you have a bunch of people who are only concerned with themselves and about how good am I going to do and are just competing against their other teammates, Well, now you have a situation where, let's say maybe I get a great hit, but my teammate behind me is like, I don't want that person scoring because that's going to help them score runs. Or maybe it's a ball is hit when we're on defense and it goes out to the center field wall. And that requires a relay in order to get a runner who's running home. And we have such poor team chemistry because we're all in it for ourselves that we don't communicate, that we drop the ball and all of a sudden that guy scores. Again, we lose. The key with baseball is you've got to bring those two things together. So you've got to be responsible for yourself and make sure you're practicing, making sure that you're developing, making sure that you're being successful. But you also have to be focused on the greater team aspect and how we work together and build. I think that's such a great lesson that has really kind of stuck with me throughout my life in terms of I've got to always take care of myself, but I can't just make it about myself. I've always got to be bringing my teammates and the people I work with along with me because that will help the overall organization succeed. And in that organizational success, that also helps me succeed, which I also want. So it's kind of like this idea of this selfless selfishness, where by being selfless and helping other people, I'm also helping myself. And so I learned that that's a big one. Obviously, the leadership qualities are huge. I love the idea of all of the hard, unsexy work that you have to do behind the scenes, where you're having to put in the hours, doing conditioning and practicing in the cold. I mean, my first practice when I went to college was in 13 degrees and freezing rain. I'm a kid who grew up in Houston. I'm used to playing in 100-degree heat. That's where I play baseball, not 13 and freezing rain. But you know what? It's those unsexy moments, those miserable moments when you're conditioning and you're dressed in all sweat because it is freezing cold. Or those early morning workouts where you're going to the gym and you're lifting and it's 6 o'clock in the morning and you hurt from the day before, but this is what it takes. And you learn that in order to be successful on that big stage, that big moment where the lights are brightest and you want to step up and just compete, the only way you do that successfully is if you've done all of the work ahead of time. And I think there's a beautiful lesson in that you've always got to be prepared for both of those aspects of growth in any job, in any role as you get older, even outside of sports.
It reminds me of your practice and preparation blog post there that we'll link to in the show notes. But it's funny because you don't see that ever, like you practicing, and we'll get more into this later, but like practicing, say you're closing arguments and you're doing it with your friends constantly, which is something that's funny. Like I was trying to put myself in your shoes and just going to friends and like, hey, can I just talk to you for like 3 minutes about this or whatever, however long it is. I'd be like nervous just to do it to my friends, but you need that putting in the reps there so that when the lights are on, you do shine. With college, going back there, were you, I guess you studied history. So were you thinking about this is the path to law, or why did you start studying history and get into that?
Yeah, that's a fun story. So I went to Haverford College because I wanted to go to a small liberal arts college. I wanted to develop my thinking skills. I wanted to be in that liberal arts world. And I also wanted to get out of Texas and see something different. I thought that was important. And so I went to this school that is 1,200 kids. Every person lives on campus. It's super small. And I went and I did the normal thing of, well, everybody needs business people, but a liberal arts college doesn't have a business program. So for our school, what you take if you want to go that route is you end up taking some sort of economics major. Well, at my school, economics means lots of math, lots of calculus, lots of things that I do not like. So I tried it and it was horrible. I mean, I am not used to failure. That is not something that happens a whole bunch in my life. And I have never failed more miserably. I have never tried harder and still just been completely unsuccessful. So when I went in, I didn't really want to be an economics major, but that was the path to some sort of business degree. And I quickly realized this doesn't make any sense. I've always loved history. That was always my thing. And so I had that really fun conversation that every 19-year-old kid wants to have with their parents and say, hey, mom and dad, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a history major. And they immediately give the response of, what are you thinking? There is no job out there for a history major. This is a waste of your time. Why are you doing this to yourself? you're setting yourself up for failure. So we have this conversation. I remember like literally to exactly where we were. We were seated at an IHOP. My parents had come up to visit me. It was baseball season. We were seated at the IHOP. I was devouring pancakes because I was in college and I could get away with that still for like lunchtime. I'm telling them, and I just remember their faces just appalled at what I'm saying to them. Like, here is their son who they had such high hopes for, and I'm throwing it all down the drain. But I finally convinced them, and by convinced, I mean I told them I was doing it. So I quickly switched to being a history major because I loved it. Like, that's what I wanted to do. I love history. I always have. I still do. I'm sure that I always will. So I switched and started studying history and a lot of the kind of different intersections of history and politics and religion so that I could really just get a grasp on the things that were interesting to me, which I knew meant I'd have to go on and get a graduate degree, which meant I was going to go to law school.
That's something that we've been fascinated with. Basically, I have a friend that we do some just conversations between us two on the podcast. And we talk a lot about breaking up with your parents and this idea that everyone's just so scared about what pressures they're putting on. Oh, Robbie, you can't study history. You're meant to go into business. And how are you going to get a job in business with history or law in this case? But it's something where you just follow what you're passionate about. And clearly you can be the best at it. And now you're starting to, create your own products around what you're good at. And I'm sure I always get most excited about teaching history and stuff like that. We've had some podcasts breaking down books with like the history of money, for example. I love that stuff. Like, it's so fun for me to just teach people. But you get into history. Was it like, what aspects of history was cool to you? Was it like one era, or you just like the idea of it as everything?
Yeah, so I don't want to get into a deep discussion on this part because I think you did some talk on this was Genghis Khan. And when you were talking about the money one, I remember listening to that. So I love Genghis Khan. First off, I think he's fascinating. I think his story is fascinating. I think the Mongols are fascinating people. But in college, really what I studied was ancient Rome and kind of the way that they used nationalism in their society to really kind of build up their population and control the power base there in Rome. So a lot of that was looking at kind of the idea of like the Colosseum and how they use kind of this idea of bread and circuses. And if you control the mob, you control the people and you control the power. So I studied a lot of that. That also translated into studying nationalism in terms of the Balkans and also more modern kind of sport and spectacle and how that's used. So looking at baseball in the Americas, looking at soccer in Europe and kind of those ideas, which was really interesting to me. Additionally, I studied a lot of the like 70s and 80s in US history and how politics, religion actually came together to really influence where we were in 2006, 2008, 2010, and kind of predicting where we'd go in the future.
I just love, I kind of wish I was like you. I studied basically economics. So I was the one, I did fail my first math class, but I had friends that were good at math. So they kind of coached me through. But yeah, it just gets me excited thinking about all these different areas of the world, how they all develop, and then you mix it with sports too. But you also love traveling. And did you start getting into the world of traveling in college, like doing a study abroad? Probably not with baseball, I assume. That'd be tricky. But where did travel come into the picture?
I was somewhat fortunate to travel some as a child. My father traveled all the time. That was really his job. He was the VP of real estate and facilities for a huge oil company. He traveled all over the world and would tell me all these stories of places he would go. And so it always kind of stuck in my mind that this is something I wanted to do. I wanted to see more of the world. And it was also always interesting because of his job. He would bring people who were traveling to Houston that he worked with to our house for dinner. So I got to meet a lot of different people from different places of the world. And I was always fascinated by their stories and their lives and just meeting them. So I knew that was always going to be something I wanted to do. It didn't really take off, though, for me until after I graduated law school was really when I started having the ability to travel, because that was really the first time I started making any sort of income, which meant I could say, these are the things I'm going to prioritize. So I really started traveling a lot, both by myself and also with friends or, significant others, and just going to places that really challenged my worldview. I mean, the first time I went to Southeast Asia and had something that was spicy, this is not a knock on my mother. I love my mother. She's fantastic. She makes wonderful pies. Like, if it is a classic American dish, she'll make it and make it well. The problem is she doesn't like spice or any sort of real seasoning to things other than, basic salt and pepper, which my dad is fine with and I am not. I found out. So when I went to Southeast Asia for the first time and experienced all these spices and just the heat, my entire world opened up. And I said, oh, there's this whole other world out here of food and experience and things like that. So that was really the moment that I just dove in and said, I want to see the world. So I started travel. I traveled a little bit in Southeast Asia. I've been to Japan. I went to Morocco. I've been a number of places in Europe. I've gone down to South America and been to Medellin and been to Costa Rica and Guatemala. And just as much travel as I can get is what I do. Obviously, COVID has really made that quite miserable. And I am hopeful that soon I'll be able to travel again.
It's funny because you say that your kind of your palate opens up with the spices, and you can now it makes sense connecting it with history why the spice trade was so important and why everyone just wanted to find a route to the east. But it is cool because Henry and I, that person that you saw me talking to, we went to China and had our minds blown by the culture there, and constantly we've generally traveled a lot, like been to Colombia, Panama, all over the world basically, and it does open your eyes to everything. Is I'm trying to think, like, because a lot of people stay in their own little bubbles and they don't really see these diverse perspectives. Like, would you almost say you basically need to travel these days to really become like a proper informed citizen, or like should everyone go out and travel to really build these different perspectives and understand different cultures?
My answer to that is yes. Obviously, there's nuance to that, right? Some people don't have the financial resources to do that. And I'm not unaware of that hardship that certain people have. But if they have the ability to, I think they absolutely should, because you start to see the world through a different lens. You start to understand maybe some of the ideas that we hold when we're younger because we aren't experiencing that aren't necessarily true. Maybe we start to understand that people are people no matter where we are, and most of us want the same basic things. It's just an eye-opening experience when you start to see other parts of the world and how people live. And also, I think it's important. I live here in Texas, and there's certainly poverty, right? I mean, there's people who are homeless or living in poor conditions, and that is obviously a problem. But then you go over to some of these other countries, third world countries, and you see the level of poverty that these people are living in. And it is so much worse. And a lot of them, though, still have a really positive outlook on life. I think there's something to be said about realizing the position that we're in here in the US and realizing the position that other people are in, and also trying to figure out why are people in other parts of the world being able to find happiness even when their position maybe isn't so nice. I just think there's a value in that.
That for me, I mean, I've seen the exact same thing because I'm Cuban, but I never went to Cuba until freshman year of college. And I saw these people that it's a destitute way of living, like unimaginable for most people, but many of them were as happy, if not happier, especially when dancing started and just socializing. And so that community aspect really pulled them up, and they were a lot happier than people that I knew that were literally billionaires. And these people are happier than them. So I that's one thing that I urge. And granted, I know it's monetarily sometimes difficult, but like I went backpacking around South America for the cost of like a $500 plane ticket, and the rest was just hostels. So I feel like it's more achievable for most people in a non-COVID environment, but that's obviously changed everything. Going back to school, so were you graduating now with a history degree and you were like, shit, how do I get a job? and lawyer was the first thing to come to mind, or where did that play in?
No, it wasn't really like that. So the way that came about goes back to kind of that freshman year where I was in the econ world, but I was like, I don't like this. And I'd always been interested in law and in politics, in large part because my favorite show starting in senior year of high school was The West Wing. I've written about that. I will talk about that until my dying day, I'm sure. And I remember watching it and just being inspired by it, and also understanding that so much of our country, at least in the US, is controlled by who understands the rules and who understands how to create laws. So I said, you know what? There's a value in learning this stuff so I can know the rules so that I can figure out how to play with them. The way you do that is you go to law school. So pretty quickly on, I realized even when I was in the econ world, I still was thinking, oh, law still seems like something I want to do. I want that fundamental understanding. So when I switched to history, it was a very clear, that was part of how I finally convinced my parents, is I said, yes, I'm going to be a history major, and then I'm going to go to law school. And that kind of gave them there's still this glimmer of hope, because now he's not going to be a complete failure. It just means it's going to take us longer for him to achieve some sort of success. And that was really kind of the route I went. Now, I didn't go directly into law school. I took a year off and did something that I think far more people should be doing. And that is just taking a basic sales job. Like, I went to a nutrition store and just sold nutrition supplements and protein powders and vitamins and that sort of stuff, because it taught me a number of lessons. One was just, I need to make sure I'm successful in this other stuff, because I don't love coming into a 9 to 5 and just selling stuff every day and that kind of being the day-to-day grind. I also learned how to sell things, which is an incredibly important skill. If you can't sell ideas or products, or especially yourself, you're never going to find success. So being in that role taught me how to interact with customers, how to listen to their questions, how to ask them proper questions, how to guide them to what I wanted them to go, like how to produce information that was given in a persuasive way so that they wanted to see it. It also demonstrated to me that looking the part, because at the time I was big into working out still. I mean, I'm from a baseball background, so I just continue that on, which helped me sell more product because I look like, oh, he worked out. So they would trust my opinion. And I learned, oh, the actual physical appearance type stuff, that matters too, which is why when I'm talking to people on Zoom or things of that nature, I say, look, you need to be aware of how these things present and the impact you're making. Or it's the reason why you wear a suit when you go to an interview. It's the reason why, as an attorney, I want to look a certain way when I'm presenting to a courtroom. And those lessons have just always stuck with me. And I think that it's incredibly powerful and taught me a lot. And it was just 1 year of sales. So that's kind of the in-between period there.
Reminds me of David Perel's post on serendipity, where he talks about you always want to be dressed up like hotel bathroom or hotel lobby. I forget the exact term, but like you look like you could pass for a 5-star hotel guest, just like going through the lobby or going to the bathroom there. Always be presentable. And then obviously when you're selling, that is the pressure cooker of how persuasive am I? How well can I build trust with someone else? And so I'm guessing that gives you then a leg up coming into law school, because most people probably haven't faced a lot of rejection, a lot of these skills that you build through sales. Did that translate?
In terms of a leg up, I don't think it gave me a leg up for law school. I think it gave me a leg up for being a trial lawyer.
Sorry, I'm conflating the two, but yeah.
Because that was essentially what trial law is going in front of people and telling them that I'm right, and that my case is better than the other person's case. So I think that those skill sets directly translated. And it's one of those things, again, I think a lot of people would look at that experience and say, really? Like that's not an impressive experience. And I would push back on that and tell them that was one of the most important experiences I could have had, because of the skills I learned. They translate. Like selling a nutrition product is the same as selling somebody being guilty of murder. It's just on a different kind of level of the stakes. So I think that it played a huge role in me just becoming very comfortable with how to ask questions, how to guide people in a certain way, and how to speak very persuasively.
It's funny. I didn't quite have the same sales background after college, but I went and worked for a dating company, and we basically taught guys how to talk to girls, whether in just seeing them like in a coffee shop, on the street, in a club, whatever. And it's kind of the same thing, right? Like you want to present yourself well, look good, and then you're basically trying to persuade them that you're awesome, or flip the switch kind of, and kind of reverse roles, like they're the seller, you're the buyer. But a lot of interesting things come from just doing something that maybe most people wouldn't think about doing for their first job. So I think that's maybe one of the lessons is like, hey, this isn't your career for the rest of your life. Do something maybe like a sales job, maybe something in wilder along your passions, and you can see where it takes you. And it obviously pays off after coming through law school, which I assume was a bit of a grind. But I guess we can talk about that for a second. Was law school in particular, like, was that as difficult as maybe most people imagine it, or what was that experience like for you?
Law school it's a weird animal. I would say that it is very challenging because you're competing with all of your classmates, but you also want to be friends with your classmates, which is a weird dynamic. I also was in law school shortly after the 2008 collapse, which saw SMU going from about 50% of students going into big law jobs, which are the big jobs you think of like Harvey Specter and Suits. And the big jobs where people are earning $160,000, $200,000 a year straight out of law school. So SMU prior to 2008 was putting around 50% of their class into those jobs. When I went there, it had plummeted to under 10%, which meant now all of a sudden there's a ton of competition trying to get that, especially because when I was entering in, people were still very nervous about what kind of other legal jobs would be out there. So that made it a bit of a strange dynamic. In terms of the actual learning, it's a weird process at first because you're learning by reading old cases that you don't really understand why you're reading them. You don't understand really what you're supposed to take out of it. But the thing, most of what law school is about is teaching you how to think like a lawyer, which is really just being able to analyze things and go and do research and then come up with an answer. So it's basically there's an issue, and then here's the way it applies, and here's the conclusion. So it's useful for like a day-to-day kind of framework to approach the world, but you're not learning a ton of. I think people think that lawyers just know the law off the top of their head. Very few lawyers know a bunch of law off the top of their head because the law is constantly changing based on court cases, which means most of what we do is read things, research things, and then come back and say, here's what the research says, here's how it applies to what I just read, the facts that we have. So it's much more along those lines, which means the learning process is strange. You do a lot of Socratic method, which is teaching you to think. So really, it's just about how your brain is working. How do you go through hypotheticals? How do you kind of go down these different rabbit holes? How do you do here's a bunch of strategic thinking where we go down different roads to see which way it leads us, which to me was pretty fun in all honesty, but there were some classes that sucked. Like I took income tax and hated that. That was horrendous. So I quickly realized income tax was not for me. And a lot of the other courses were super boring, but the stuff I always gravitated towards is I loved competing and being in trial. So I wanted everything that I could get my hands on that came to trial work, which meant my biggest classes were all of the stuff geared towards trial advocacy and how do we speak well and what are the persuasive techniques we can use and what's the proper communication forms, and then actually competing in the national mock trial tournaments where I was on the teams and actually going and traveling to like Georgetown and Michigan and California and competing on these things. Like that was the stuff I loved because that made me feel like a real lawyer. That's the stuff you see on TV. That's Law and Order SVU, right? That's the cool stuff. So I love that. And I thought that was incredibly useful information. And it was incredibly powerful for how I developed as a lawyer and as a person. The unfortunate thing for me is SMU doesn't really care that much about that world. Like they want all their people to go into corporate law, where generally speaking, people make more money right out of the gate so that those people can then give money back to the school which is really why they push that. That was not how I wanted to go, so I was not necessarily their favorite student, but that's all right.
Yeah, always the the monetary incentives playing a big factor there. But like with your parents, you just do what you want essentially, and you'll find a way to crush it at whatever that is with the competitive nature. With mock trial, because that's something that I only dabbled in high school. Actually, like an absurd. That was one of the instances of me fearing public speaking, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna do mock trial so I can get better at it. And then I go up and I had the closing argument for my first case ever. Like 30 people, friends, family, whatever, the judge, everyone. And I'm just like quivering at the stage. Thank God we had suits because I was literally sweating through everything. But actually, geez, I forgot about this story. But like there was my actual argument was like, look at the defendant. I think it was like Miss Taylor or something. And I'm like, look at Miss Taylor. She's 18 years old. Does she look like a criminal to you? And like the judge was like, are you kidding me? Look like a criminal? I just got reamed out. But like you get through these hard trials, I guess, literally, and you realize it's not that bad. I'm sure competing at the national level with mock trial, you must have had an insane confidence boost coming from that. What was that actually like being on a team? Was it similar to baseball, just now in your realm of law?
Mock trial is a strange situation that you're thrown into because the teams I was on. So first off, you'd have to try out to make the teams, and I was always going for what the national mock trial team, so the most prestigious at SMU, which is what everybody's trying out for. Most of the time, you're taking more of the older students on those teams. But obviously, when I was in my first year of law school, I tried out for them because I wanted to be on the best team. That's just who I am. I fortunately made it, but then that puts you in a situation where it was me and 5 other people on that team, and there were only 4 spots, which meant now it is truly a competition of we're working together, but I want the spot. Like, I am not the person that likes to sit on the bench. Never was. That is not me. Not to be a bad teammate, but I hate it. I hated it in basketball when I was younger, they would have rules about how long you could play, and then you have to like sub out and have other people play. I'd always get super angry at the best games for me was when only 5 people would show up. So there was no rest. Those were my dream times. So for mock trial, it's weird because you're competing, but you're also friends with them and you're trying to build a relationship. However, since you're joining for like me, my first year, I don't know anything, which means my coach has to teach everything. And there's a very steep learning process where you're going from, I know nothing. I could make a Jon Snow reference right there, but I'll pass. And then you're immediately going up to where in order to compete, you really have to ramp up very quickly. And the older students on the team are obviously much more prepared because they've already had a year of mock trial under their belt. So there's a ton of kind of growth that has to happen when you're in that situation. Luckily for me, I mean, it went well and I ended up achieving that and competed and had really positive results throughout my time. But it's strange because when you're on those teams, you really are taking truly competitive alpha type people on the team. It's not like baseball, you can get away. Like you can have some people who are okay being a bench player or waiting their turn before they become a starter. Maybe they're okay waiting until junior year. But here, because it's such a small amount of time you have for mock trial, every person on that national mock trial team, the prestigious team, wants to be starting. That is just in their DNA. That's who they are. So it's a really strange dynamic. And it's strange too, because now I coach that team. So trying to navigate that world and remembering what I felt and what I went through is both helpful, but also still really challenging because I know exactly what's going through their minds. And I want them to be reaching out and being like, I want the starting spot. I want that other person on the bench, but I also want them working together. And it's this weird dynamic. So mock trial is an incredibly fun experience, but it was by far the most work I ever put in law school. Like the amount of time I put in for the amount of credit hours that I got was ridiculous.
But I'm sure it shows clearly with experience. Anyone that sees that you competed on the national level and were successful, they're going to be just astounded. It reminds me the team culture, I guess, reminds me of Drive to Survive. I don't know if you've seen that on Netflix.
Mm-mm.
Amazing series. But Formula One, they basically have a team of two for each Formula One team. And it's super competitive, like who's going to be the first one. Because if you get kicked off, it's so hard to find a spot because there are only 20 spots in the entire competition. So within the team, it's like you want to support each other, but you see cars on the same team crashing all the time because they're just trying to edge out the other person. How do you now balance that? Like, what have you taken from your experiences and how do you coach maybe differently, effectively with the team?
The big thing is just to manage the expectations of like, this is a competition. We understand that. We also aren't going to reward you if you are very cutthroat. So like part of our analysis, me and my law partner, we actually coach it together. So we take the approach that in order for the individual to be successful, you've got to make sure that the team is successful. And if you don't do that, that will be a mark against you. So we try to instill this idea of we will actually be grading you more positively on the individual level if you're putting in the work with the team. Now, that doesn't mean that those conversations, when we tell the two people who aren't starting, that those conversations go smoothly. I typically am on the phone or in person for quite a large amount of time when we're talking about that because they're breaking down, they're upset, they're crying, they're just broken because they put all their time and energy into this and then don't get it. So that kind of sucks, not going to lie. And it's really hard. And really what you try to do is you try to make sure that they are still getting a lot of value out of the experience. And so I always am a fan of we want to have fun, but we also want to win. So when we're practicing, it's let's have fun, but let's also make sure everybody's improving. So even if you don't necessarily get to compete, you're still walking out with a lot of skills that you would have never had otherwise. Because the level of access you're getting and the amount of time that I put into this, it's hard to fathom for somebody outside. Like, for an example, last night I was there from 8 p.m. until 1:30 in the morning, working with students, going through a trial run, and then talk to my co-coach for another hour after that. That's a regularly occurring thing. And me and him are regularly talking about how to help the students and what needs to be done and how to gear up practice. I mean, on a weekly basis, I'm probably putting 40 plus hours into just mock trial with my students on a one-on-one basis, on a team basis, on preparing for that. And that is not my job. Like I am doing that purely to have some fun and help some people get better at stuff and compete. That's how we're able to still make it worth their while by saying, look, the access you're getting and the learning you're getting from us is at such a high level and is of such quality that even if you don't get to start, you've gotten a ton of value out of this. And I promise you, it's going to set you up better for the next semester of mock trial or the next year of mock trial, or certainly your career and the connections you make on this team. Like these are all super competitive people, myself and my co-coach included, which means you've now built this network of people who are always going to be very successful and driven and want to help you out.
I love that. I think people, like, no matter if you make the top four or not, like the amount of learning and knowledge you'll get, and having mentors like you, it's incredible that you put in 40 hours a week to something that's essentially just passion, like caring about the students, I guess, and your team. It shows that is I don't know, it's underrated having just going through the experience just for the mentorship. So I guess you graduated, you had your own mock trial experience. Actually, sorry, I wanted to ask this while we're talking about coaching. With feedback and giving feedback to students, have you noticed, I think I read a little bit about this maybe in your user manual on your website, but what do you typically do to give feedback that's accepted by people? Because I think this is so often, like you'll see, I'm sure you're coaching people on communication constantly. What's the best way for them to internalize it and not just like give you a a nod and be like, sure, but not actually listen to you?
Feedback is an art. And each time you give it, you have to do it differently. It can't be the same every time, which means sometimes it needs to be very positive feedback where you're kind of building them up and you're just telling them all the good stuff that they did to try to help them build their confidence, grow, and then you can kind of come at them later on with some more negative stuff. You also need to tell a lot of, in my opinion, real stories so that they understand why this advice is coming where it is. So I use a lot of my real life trial experience to say, this is when I saw this happen in real life, and here is what occurred because I did this, or an attorney did what you just did, and they got reamed by the judge. Like if you did that in a real courtroom, the judge would throw a fit at you. So I try to do a lot of things where I'm calling out real experience and stories I've lived or seen to help them understand this isn't coming from a place of just a vacuum. This is coming from, I'm trying to help you so it doesn't happen when it's a real judge and you're like, oh no, that is not what I want to happen. Much rather it come from me than come from a judge or come from your boss or come from, like in my case, when I was working at the DA's office, from the district attorney himself. Like I certainly don't want him to walk into the room. I mean, for instance, the very first felony trial I ever tried, the first assistant in the office of the Dallas DA's office, which is a 400 or 500 attorney office. He's the number 2 in the entire office. He is directly below the elected official. Walks into the courtroom right as I'm about to start my opening statement on my first ever felony trial and sits down right next to me as I'm literally standing up to go and deliver this. So I would much prefer my students to be prepared for that situation so that they do all the right things when the big boss is sitting right next to them than me not tell them these things and then it happens in real life. So that's one big thing that I try to do with feedback. I also am a big proponent of, like I said, kind of varying feedback. Sometimes it's really positive. Sometimes, for instance, last night, not gonna lie, I lit into my team quite a bit because I was frustrated with where they were. And it's weird because you do it in such a way that I was frustrated, not because they did a poor job, but because they're so wildly talented. I've moved the bar up so high for them that I'm now expecting them to clear that. And it's kind of this double-edged sword, right? Like you're really good, which makes me happy, but that also means I'm much harder on them because they need to improve. Again, it's done in such a way though, where it's kind of sandwiched. Like I light into them, but I'm like, look, there's so much good stuff. This is why I'm doing it because you guys are so talented, but this stuff sucked and stop doing it. And then here's when you fix it. Like this is what it looks like, which is why you have the chance to actually win a national championship. And so you're kind of sandwiching the really bad feedback in there's a lot of positives. You sucked. And here's what it looks like when you don't suck anymore, because you get to do what you want, what we set out to do, which is win a national championship.
I think it does help when you have that national championship, the beacon of light, like you're going towards this is our North Star. And hey, none of this is personal or whatever. It's just like, this is the best route to get there from all my experience. You don't want to clam up when it matters, when second command is basically right next to you on your first felony case. I guess Flash. Oh, sorry. What are you saying?
Real quick. So this is one reason, and this kind of takes me to a different point. I got asked to start coaching as soon as I graduated law school. And I told them no. And I told them no in large part because I said, I don't have any experience to back up what I'm going to be teaching. Like me just being on mock trial doesn't give me experience to teach other students how to do it. I said, let me go out and actually work. Let me try real cases. Let me get experience before I come in and start telling these people, you should trust me. You should listen to me. So I waited 5 years as a trial attorney and built up something around 80, 85 trials before I came back and started coaching. And that was because that was the only way I felt that I had any real credibility to tell these people, this is why you should listen to me. And I can ground it in this real life experience I've had. I think that is a big differentiator from a lot of people who are coaching or teaching these types of things. They don't have that real world experience. They haven't actually gone out and gotten results. Or in my case, I've been hit in the mouth a whole bunch of times in trial. Like I've seen things go south and go sideways and just blow up in my face. And you learn how to deal with that, and you learn how to grow, and you test your ideas, and you test your philosophies, and you get feedback, and you continue to iterate and iterate and iterate until it's finally something that you say, I can take this to other people, and now they should be able to trust and believe in my product, which is really what happened. And that's also why it's been successful for me giving that feedback, is because I didn't jump right into coaching. I didn't jump right into teaching. I waited until I was actually ready and could back it up.
It reminds me of your Twitter post recently about, I think it's like you can have knowledge and experience as your two ways of teaching, or I forget the exact quote, but basically you want experience. Like that's the most effective teacher or way of going about giving lessons. And that's kind of what's interesting to me is how Brandon, when I talk to him, he's like literally 19 years old and is able to build this following with relatively little experience, but he's so powerful in what he's been able to accomplish. And now you're basically doing the same. But with coming out of school and you do have that 5 years where you're just going in, I assume you start a couple years with the misdemeanors and then you do work up to the felony. You're a confident person. You talked about like how this preparation and practice keeps you from being nervous, but what does it actually feel like? Like, let's go into your head when that second command person sits down and like you're there. Are you like me, sweating, nervous, or are you like, what's your process like so that you kind of calm your nerves and get into the mode?
This takes me to a discussion I have with a lot of people when it comes to public speaking. So you're calling it nerves. And here's where I will push back. What you're feeling is energy. You're giving that energy a name and calling it nervous energy. I'm giving that energy a different name, and it's excited energy. It's anticipation, right? It's that same kind of idea of two different people given the ball, game on the line, last second shot. One is going to step up and say, I love this moment. Another is going to say, get this ball out of my hands. One feels what they call nervous. One feels excited for that opportunity. It is the same energy. It is no different. You're in the same situation. You're feeling the same stuff. It's just how you channel it. So for me, when he walks in and sits there, yes, I immediately spike, the energy spikes and I can feel it. All those things that everybody else feels, right? Heart starts racing. You start getting a little bit kind of clammy in your hands, maybe some pressure in your head. But to me, that's a sign of, oh, this is the moment. This is the moment to step up. I have a chance. Like, that's what I want. I want those people watching me do this because I know I'm ready, which means when they watch me and see me, all of a sudden it's in their mind, that guy's ready. He can do this. Because the way I got my job, and I've told this story some too, is when I went in to the Dallas DA's office. So I started at the Denton County District Attorney's office, which is a much smaller office. I came down to Dallas after 2 years. When I walked into that interview room, they asked me, why do you want this job? You're already working somewhere else. Why are you trying to leave? All this stuff. And my answer was this: I want to try the biggest, baddest, most serious cases with the most publicity. And that really was what I wanted. I wanted the biggest, baddest, most serious cases with the most publicity, because that's the kind of lights that I wanted shining on me. So when he walks in there, this is my chance to show him, you guys made the right decision. I have all these skills. I have all this talent. And you know what? Not only should I be trying this, I should be trying something bigger. You should be giving me bigger and better cases. Just because this is a first-degree felony and the guy is looking at up to 99 years in life, this isn't big enough. Give me something bigger, right? That's the mentality that goes through my mind, is this is a chance for me to show what I've got. And I think that's one of the big things I'm trying to help people understand, is these moments where we get a chance to speak in public, instead of looking at them as an opportunity where I'm going to fail and hurt myself, I want them to be looked at as an opportunity to actually succeed and to better yourself and put this vision of who you are in the minds of your bosses, your colleagues, people who are watching you, and saying, man, that guy right there, I want him when something is on the line. I want him taking the last shot. I want him arguing for me. I want him selling my idea to people. That's what I think public speaking is all about. So when I see that person walk in, I say, this is the moment, let's go.
I've felt that before too. Usually if I go up and give a presentation and then go up and give another one after, like the first one would kind of get out the nervous energy, I guess I used to call it excited energy. We can call it now. But I'd get out the jitters. And then now I'm like, oh, excited to have everyone watching. I remember in high school, we had to present to graduate, and I had like the superintendent of the schools, the principal, etc. And I started talking, but then I took a breather because I was so nervous and restarted. But uh, you saw in the presentation, the superintendent was just floored. And afterward, because I was able to teach well, and she was like, this presentation was great. So I think if you can have that reframe in your mind of just like, this is your opportunity, like seize the day sort of thing, which is a lot easier said than done. But clearly you were able to do that. You're excited more than anything when they come in, and now you have more eyes on you, so you can advance faster in your career as a competitive person, which is huge. So that was one of my questions, because corporate law, you're dealing with usually money, I assume, is one of the most important factors, but now you're dealing with lives. And that's a whole different sort of pressure. I guess in your case, you're making sure that justice is done, like the right person gets charged, versus say defending them or something. But you're dealing with lives. Like, did that play a factor? Are you thinking like, oh my God, I have someone's life in my hand, or someone's feelings for the rest of their life if they were harmed?
So, I mean, I've done both sides. So I've also
Oh,
done
okay.
defense. So I do understand that. I mean, the last case I tried before COVID hit was a case in February that was a murder charge. And that guy was looking at the rest of his life in prison, where I don't deny that he killed his brother. There was no question about it. It was on video. There was really bad stuff in that video. It looked bad. However, I believed that he really did think that he was acting in self-defense. Now, do I think that most people would have made the decisions that he made that day? No. I think most people would have made a better decision. But he didn't. And in his eyes, he was acting in self-defense. At least that was my interpretation. And this is not coming just because I'm some bleeding heart defense attorney. This was after years of being a prosecutor and trying plenty of murders and capital murders and child abuse cases. Like, I've seen bad stuff. I generally lean more towards stateside on these types of crimes. But this one I just didn't believe, and they wouldn't come down from a huge number. I think the original plea offer was something like 40 years in prison, and the dude was 35, which means he's spending most of his life in prison if he takes that. So I've written about this, and that's that first article, "Don't You Get Nervous Speaking in Trial," that I wrote talking about this, where there was a lot of pressure because you are representing someone who could go to prison if you fail. I can't think of much higher stakes than that. The only higher stakes I can think of is a death penalty case. And to be honest, in Texas these days, if it's a death penalty case, it's a slam dunk case, and it's a really bad one. Like, those kinds of things don't get tossed around lightly anymore. So this was one where someone really could go to prison for a long time for something that I didn't think was warranted. He had a family. He had a stepson that he took care of. His stepson loved him. I'd gotten to know him. I'd gotten to know his family. So I remember just feeling that pressure. And I remember we finished up that trial on a Friday, at least the evidence phase. And we were going to do closing arguments on Monday. And that was all me, which meant I had the weekend to really think about it. And I just remember driving home and feeling kind of this sense of, I don't know, dread or melancholy, because it was just really heavy. I felt good about how the trial had gone, but it's still, there's somebody dead and there was a lot of bad stuff. And people want to hold somebody accountable for it when somebody dies. Like, somebody dies, generally you're going to jail or prison for some amount of time. That's just the way people generally think in today's world. I remember driving home and I was just sitting there thinking, like, I've got to come up with something. And I've been working for kind of weeks on this closing argument and been practicing a bunch and had good ideas. And I liked a lot of what I was doing, but I hadn't nailed it yet. And I knew that I could feel it. Like, I had that feeling. The closing, it would be good, but good wasn't enough. I knew that this needed to be one of those special moments, something that really transformed people and made them feel something that they just did not expect when they walked into a courtroom. Like I needed it to be that level of power, which is heavy. And I just remember driving home and I didn't have anything really going on. I was just thinking and trying to figure out, where am I going with this? Where am I going with this? And I did mention this earlier. And so I'm trying to find a sense of inspiration, an idea to really ground my closing argument on. And I came across, I remember back to an episode in The West Wing where they're talking about capital punishment. And there's this theme in there where one of the characters is Toby Ziegler, and he is being confronted by the public defender who's saying, you need to stop this execution. And he goes to the synagogue, and his rabbi is giving a sermon about vengeance is not Jewish. And I remember later in that episode, Toby goes back and he's talking to the rabbi. There's a moment where he's talking and it's very quiet. They're using music really well and the lighting. And you hear kind of this really melancholy song going on up front, and they're kind of talking. And finally, Toby realizes it's all kind of a setup to get him to stop the capital punishment. And the rabbi says, she's our communications director, which is interesting because Toby was their communications director. But I remember him talking about this idea of vengeance is not Jewish and just how that scene made me feel. So I went home and I watched it probably 5 times just to really feel it all. So all weekend, all I did was figure out, how can I recreate that mood and that feeling in my jury on Monday morning when I deliver this closing argument. And granted, I don't have music. I can't play the scene. I can't play with the lighting. I can't do any of that. So I've got to do it just by the way I'm talking and the way I'm speaking and the way I'm moving. And so I went into it, and again, I mean, I've never felt such weight on my shoulders as I did there when I walked in the courtroom that morning. And then obviously the judge asked for a closing argument. I get up and I go, and it was one of those special moments where you kind of step outside of your body and you're watching yourself perform it, and you can see that it's going the way you want it to go. And you can see the jurors all crying, and you can see them being moved, and you can see that what you're doing is working. And so in those moments, I really think that pressure and that weight of working in this world forces you to create something that is incredibly powerful and is incredibly memorable, to the point that when I walked back, I was actually working. My boss was seated at the table too. And I walked back and he just looked at me, and he's been doing this for 22 years and always a defense attorney, always trial law. I mean, he's tried hundreds of cases. And he just looked at me and goes, that's the best closing argument I've ever seen. And he wasn't saying it to blow, smoke up, and just give me praise unnecessarily. But something had really been achieved because of that pressure. And there's something powerful when you're placed in those moments that you either step up to greatness, or somebody is going to lose their life in a way. And you just have to take on that responsibility. And it's not for everybody. It's really not. It is a tough and heavy thing to do. I mean, I've had plenty of child abuse cases when I was a prosecutor. Like I say to people, I've had to remove a part of my soul from what I did when I was a child abuse prosecutor because of the things I've seen. And that's really the only way you can do it. And so those instances felt just as heavy, where I was representing victims who had just been sexually abused for years, or children who had been murdered through starvation by their parents. And so they were no longer there. Like the stuff you deal with is so heavy and so impactful that you are forced to embrace that pressure and really create something that's special. So it's both hard and kind of haunting to think about, but it created the speaker that I am today because I had to embrace those moments and really come through.
Yeah, I can't even fathom what that's like. And then to be able in that environment to channel all the I guess the mood and just create your own world where you have the jury to tears for what you're saying, and you don't have any props, any way of manipulating things other than your body language, your voice, how you're speaking. And I guess going back to the West Wing, like some of the content that you were able to kind of mesh with your mind. And is that something that like you've seen people do? Maybe, I usually hear music to get people thinking that way, but this is a unique approach, at least for me, of watching maybe your favorite, most powerful shows that demonstrate the mood that you're going for. Where did you come up with this sort of approach?
So this is kind of the performative speaking approach that I just developed over my own time. And I don't have a real rhyme or reason as to why that worked. It's just the way my brain thinks and works and functions. It's kind of been the way I've approached most major speeches, most ways that I view the world. And I think a lot of people will use these types of things in a way that they'll reference them to the jury or they'll reference them to the people they're talking to. And there's certainly a value in that. But that's not actually what I'm going for most of the time. Like the jury would never know what scene I was referencing when I was delivering the speech because I never talked about it. Now, I did change that vengeance is not Jewish to vengeance is not justice. So I used that kind of theme throughout my closing argument in a way. But it just really developed over my time starting in law school. I remember the first ever closing argument I did for one of my coaches. I used the scene from the Fast and Furious where Vin Diesel is saying it doesn't matter whether you win by an inch or a mile, winning is winning. And kind of all those people are around Paul Walker and they all kind of erupt when he says that. You know, when he's ask any racer, any real racer, right? And he's doing all that. And when he says it, everybody just kind of loses their mind in this huge moment because really all that matters is you win. And I remember that being the first time I ever really used that kind of idea. And I saw how it worked on my coaches. And so I just continued to build off of that. So my entire career as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, as a civil litigator, I've always been using these ideas to frame the types of emotion I'm trying to create in my audience. And the reason I think it's so successful, music works great too. I love music. I think that's a great way to do it also. I mean, I will talk about that pretty regularly. But these scenes help you even more to picture it. You can actually picture what that looks like. You can see what was the pacing that somebody was talking at? What was the volume? How were they playing around with kind of their rhythm? What movements are they doing when they're actually delivering these types of things? And you can start to figure out why are those things working on me? Which means when I figure out why it's working on me, I can figure out how I can make that work on other people. So that scene I was referencing, they talk very quietly. It's kind of choppy in the way that they speak in terms of the rhythm. There's a lot of moments of silence, of just kind of reflecting on what's being said. There's almost this sense of exasperation that they're talking with. The lighting is really low. So what I did, a lot of that was recreating those ideas in that situation. So I'm talking very quietly. I'm talking very slowly. I'm making my jury really wait for me to continue on and giving them a lot of silence throughout this. Doing a lot of getting very close to them. So I'm almost in their space and we're almost having a more intimate conversation instead of me talking at them. So there's a lot of tools you can use when you are able to see it. And that's maybe more for a visual learner, right? Maybe somebody is a more auditory learner and the music is the best way for them. And that's perfectly fair, which is why performative speaking isn't about just movies or TV. It's any sort of art form. And it could be even like your favorite piece at a museum. It could be architecture. It could be a cultural experience that you've had. The idea is figure out those emotional sources. Figure out what you want your audience to feel and find one of those sources that made you feel that way. Now the issue is you're speaking from a place of confidence because you are so aware of what that feels like. You're no longer worried necessarily about they're going to see that I don't really know what I'm talking about because really all you're talking about is creating that emotion that you know. So then you can use those tools to try to recreate that in your audience. And that's why I think it's been really successful as I teach my law students to basically channel the same ideas and use those same concepts in order to connect with an audience and move them emotionally.
What's great too is you've had this almost testing ground for at least 5+ years with the mock trial team to basically teach what you're saying with performative speaking. and channeling their emotions from when they're watching or when they're listening or whatever it is that moves them, and just take that to the courtroom. I think that's so powerful, and that's why it's so important to have the experience. And now that you're ready to kind of teach on a broader scale, it's even more impactful with kind of your shift to Twitter. And one thing I love your Twitter too, because you'll mention some references that you love. Like I was just watching The Social Network last night because I had to see your clips of when Sean Parker was selling Mark Zuckerberg. And it's so awesome. Like I want you to do more of that, more. It reminds me a little bit of the charisma on command sort of mentality, just very actionable now. And so one, definitely follow Robbie Crab on Twitter, but it's interesting to see you dive into this world and this whole, I don't know, personal development and building in public and just creating it and kind of taking what's in your head and putting it to more so the masses. Did that come, like, where did that come from? Because one thing that's interesting to me is lawyers, I was always afraid of something like that for multiple reasons, but you're working on an hourly basis, like you can only impact so many people typically. Is that something that pushed you to maybe get more leverage on the internet, reach more people? Why did you double down on Twitter and the internet?
So Twitter, for a couple of reasons. One, yes, you can reach a lot more people and you can start having a broader impact. Two, Twitter is a place that you can find a network of people that are like-minded that you want to build with. And it's so much easier, right? I don't have to worry about where they live. I'm in Dallas. If I want to find these people, it's really hard. And I'm stuck to the people that only live in Dallas because that's where I live. On Twitter, there's tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people out there that I can connect with from anywhere that I'm at because I have a laptop and I have a phone. So you just are making these connections where you're finding friends and finding people to work together with. And I think that's a really interesting part of Twitter. And then there's also this concept of there's so many people giving away their knowledge that I can learn a ton from them. So by really getting active there, I've had a ton of really cool conversations. Like I talked recently with Justin McElroy, who was the speechwriter for General Mattis, General Petraeus, and Secretary Panetta. Like that is as high level speech writing as you can get. I can't think of another place other than Twitter where I would have ever had that type of connection with somebody and got to talk about the things that we talked about, which is interesting because I think most people would say, I just want to talk about those other people. And I just want to talk about Justin and how he created these speeches and like what that process is like, because I'm genuinely interested in those topics, which is so cool because you find other people like that. And you find people likewise who are reaching out to me who are interested in things that are similar to me. And we just start talking about ideas. So Twitter to me is just this really interesting place where it's basically like the best college university you could ever find, right? You make friends, you get to have really interesting conversations. You're learning at the same time. You have really cool teachers ahead of you. And maybe one day you become one of them. And then you also have these people who are kind of maybe like the grade below you who are looking up to you and you're getting to teach them. So you're getting to work on your ideas and clarifying them and having an impact. So it's just hard to say how amazing Twitter has been. But in terms of why I kind of came more to the online world, that is really what you're talking about. As a lawyer, most of what I can do is earn with my time. My time is worth X amount of dollars an hour, and I can work with one client for that hour. But online, I can create something that reaches many more people. I can create a Twitter thread that reaches 5,000 people. I can create a course that all of a sudden has 25, 30, 40 people enrolled. So now when I'm teaching for that hour and a half, I'm talking to 30 people instead of working with one client. That's really the power of this online world, is the ability to reach more people and leverage what I know to, one, help myself out and kind of live a more flexible lifestyle, but also help a lot more people out. Because I learned very quickly at SMU when I'm teaching this course and the oral advocacy type stuff, which really is a dumb way that the law school names it, because really it should just say persuasive speaking. But lawyers have to try to sound complicated and smarter than they really are. But when I teach that class, there is generally between 100 to 200 students who want to take it, and I will only be able to take about 15. Just because when you're in person and actually teaching these things and doing live demonstrations, you can only do so much, which means there's a lot of people who want these skills that I can't reach. But online, if I create this sort of thing, the Jack Butcher style, build once, sell twice, or the David Perel style, rite of passage, all of a sudden the numbers game no longer matters, and I can reach so many more people and help them. Because if we learned anything from last night in the presidential debate, which millions of people watched and has the ability to determine who is our next president, speaking matters. Being a good public speaker is a competitive advantage. They both were terrible last night. And if one of them would have been really good, it would be an easy decision as to who should be voted for. It is such a competitive advantage for people that if they just take anything away from watching that debate last night, you can see what happens when you just increase your speaking ability.
I I do want to ask really quick. I generally don't go in the political realm, but if there was one change overall that you could make to the speech last night, we're talking about the first presidential debate. What's like the one? I guess you have two different speakers, but was there one thing that you would change that you think would make a person stand out, a candidate in that arena? I guess
it just was. It's poor all the way around. Like, it's really hard. They're just not good speakers, and I don't go a ton into politics, but I point out the debate thing just to show people, millions of people are tuning into this. It is something that matters, even if we think we don't need to get better at it. That couldn't be more wrong. When we're talking about the president of the United States, there is no higher office in this country, and yet it is largely determined on how well somebody can speak during the debates. So why wouldn't every person realize if we get better at this as a country, as a community, on Twitter or wherever, it will help you out in every phase of your life?
Was it the 1960? Was that Kennedy Nixon that a lot of people talk about, where it stood out for the first time versus
Yes, I mean,
it used to be radio.
Right. That was when it went on TV and you could tell the differences between the two. Like, presentation matters, speaking ability matters. All those things play a huge role. I mean, we think of great speakers, and so many of them are great politicians, right? Winston Churchill, Teddy Roosevelt, JFK, Martin Luther King. There's so many important moments in our country that are defined by somebody's ability to speak well and speak powerfully to a large audience. So I just think there's such a power in this, which is why I came to Twitter and came to the online world, because so many more people need this skill development, and it's possible to do it. Like, this is not something that is impossible to teach. You just have to know where you're coming from and have to have a system in place and have tested it and really back it up with experience. And when you do that, there's a way to make people better. And it doesn't just change your career. It doesn't just change your personal life. It literally changes every interaction you will have.
That's the beauty. And it's funny for me. You've mentioned I've actually DM'd you and you've given me some tips, because I've had my own qualms in trying to be a better speaker, which recording myself with a podcast, I think almost anyone should do it just to hear themselves and the likes and ums that I would say. Right now I have my own thing that I want to work on, which is leaving pauses. Often I'll kind of ramble and then ask a question right after. I'm not sure if you've noticed something about my verbal tics already. Maybe I'll ask you after, but it helps so much to, one, have a way of seeing yourself, and then two, having a coach see you. And that's basically one of the responses you've had. And we were dating coaching, so a lot of our stuff, we're like, hey, we kind of want to like record you, have some interactions, like see what that's like. But like, you need a coach to really tell you what to do. I want to, and we might go a little bit over, so I hope you're not, I'm just so curious about this stuff. But when you have rite of passage and Jack Butcher's courses, you took two of them or several of them, what did you take from the way they approached online teaching? And now that you're going to use it on yourself, but I assume it's different than, say, in the classroom or in your mock trial team. Like, what was different? What did they do well, and now you're going to use in your own course?
So I think what Jack does really well is take all of his knowledge and turn it into a product. And Jack's story is very similar to mine in that he worked in the agency for years, learned all those skills, then went out on his own, and then created kind of this build once, sell twice model. That's very similar to mine. In the time frame, kind of the background we had, mine just happens to be law and his was design. And I look at it very similar. He is in the business of visual communication, and I'm in the business of spoken communication. So they're very much in parallel. So it was pretty obvious to me that there is a way to do this. Originally, that was more of my thought, is I'll create a product like Jack's course for my speaking stuff. One of the videos in Jack's Design Fundamentals course is David Perel on there speaking with him. And they're talking through ideas, and Jack is actually visualizing what David is talking about. That was kind of my introduction to David, which then led me down to, who is this guy? Let's follow more, which led me to Rite of Passage. Rite of Passage for me was a game changer because I saw the power of that community aspect, the live online courses where people are actually coming together and making real connections and going into breakout sessions and giving people feedback and really being supportive of one another and also holding one another accountable. For me, that was the obvious light bulb going off because I said, if this works for a writing course, a speaking course is perfect. And I started having all these ideas going through my head of, here's how I can improve it for speaking. Because I can use these breakout rooms to actually give people practice. I can give them prompts. I can make them actually work on their ability to give a tight pitch, to be clear and concise and precise. I can give them prompts to ask questions better and learn how to give feedback better and learn how to respond to answers appropriately. I can help people understand how to use silence and how to present in a persuasive way or an informative way, depending on what you're trying to do. How do we network at a party? How do we tell a story when we're having wine over dinner? Like, these are skills that I can teach people, and especially when we have these breakout rooms where people can actually practice. So I started saying there's real value to this. So now I need to merge kind of Jack's idea and David's idea into one and bring in all my experience teaching this to law students, which is really where performative speaking kind of came in. I was like, this just makes too much sense. And then it's just about getting the idea out there for people to understand why this makes so much sense and where that value comes from. And that value really is just a lot of the things I teach my law students is a direct translation into this performative speaking course, because I know the methodology that I use and how you can ramp people up very quickly to see an increase in their skills in a very short period of time, given the right kind of practice grounds, the right supportive community, and the right types of feedback. And that's really where I'm at now, is just merging all that and saying this thing is going to be incredibly fun. It's also going to be an experience that people probably at first feel a little bit like there's a fire hose going off in their face, where there's a lot to take in. But that's where that development comes. And by week 3, 4, and 5, it's going to be one of those, wow, like, look at me back then and look at me now. Because there are ways to very quickly bring people up to a higher level when they start to figure these things out.
That's one. I think it's almost, obviously no one would want this scenario, but in a place where most of our communication, or at least a large percentage of it, is online, is through Zoom, that it makes sense that you can teach this online course with everyone around the world. And you're basically, I'm assuming, teaching also like how to just be a good speaker within Zoom or within these different worlds. And the practice is exactly what's the actual game is like, or what you're going to be doing in the real world. So it translates even better than it ever could in terms of having an online course like this. And
it'll be fun because what we can do is do a lot of smaller kind of speaking situations in these breakout rooms and how I plan on using them. But then there can also be larger speaking opportunities in front of the entire group. So you're going to get this practice in front of smaller people and more intimate spaces, but then also in a larger situation where you're really facing a big group and it's all of a sudden, oh no, like, I know that feeling, it's coming on me, and how do I get over this? And then additionally, it's also going to be actually filming like videos of yourself and creating these speeches that you can upload to YouTube. So you're actually getting practice. And then people are giving you feedback based on the videos. So you can figure out, how do I get better? So when you walk out of here at the end of 5 weeks, you have 5 videos that you can point to. And let's say, David Perel in Rite of Passage likes to talk about online writing and the online personal website as the resume. And I look very much at, if you can do a good YouTube video on something in today's day and age, that's almost like that first interview where you can point people to there and say, look, that's me. I'm a good representation for your company or for this promotion. And you should hire me for this reason, because like, look at me, I'm personable, I'm likable, I'm credible, I'm authentic. Like, I'm the type of person that your company wants. And you can't get that just from words alone and a resume, but you can get that when you see somebody in person, which is where that video comes in.
That's such an interesting insight that I didn't think about till you said it, Robbie. Was like, yeah, he has his blog or creating your email newsletter, whatever the end product is going to be. And here you have a YouTube channel. Like, you're creating a YouTube channel that you can use as your portfolio that you show to future clients or future employers. And I think that's phenomenal. I just love this idea of having your digital, like, screw the resume. This is proof of work, proof of that I'm competent. And I think that's why so many people, even though you have a little bit higher price tag on this, so many people jumped on it immediately because they see the value in what you're teaching, and you do it so effectively. It's cool because you have your videos, and it's pretty much uncut, raw, like you said, one take, I assume, on at least a good amount of them, if not all. So we're able to just very easily see the value in the product. And what was it like for you when you take all their knowledge, you create your course, kind of built in front of people on Twitter, and the first hour you get 2 sales, like 2 people buying this $2,000 program, which is insane. But it's like, oh my God, people like this. What did that feel like for you?
It feels good, right? It feels validating, because there is that moment where you're almost jumping off the cliff and you're hoping that it's water underneath you and not sharp rocks. And you don't know, because you're kind of just waiting for the impact to see which one is it going to be. And then you get 2 sales. And then by the end of that early period, I had, I think, 14 or something. And at this point, we're a couple, we're, I think, still 3 weeks out, and we're at 25 people who have signed up for the course. So it's one of those experiences where you start to see, oh yeah, like, I had a good idea and I thought there was real value in here, and other people are seeing it too, which just feels good, because you want to be validated on a personal level, but it also feels good because I know the impact that the course will have on these people. Like, I am fully anticipating running this course and these people walking out of here and being able to come back and having that same type of energy people have for Rite of Passage or Jack Butcher's course, where they say, it changed my life. It opened up all these opportunities. It did A, B, and C for me. Because I really do think that will happen. And the reason I say that is the experience every student I've ever worked with has had, where they're reaching back out to me and saying, here's the impact that this had on me. And so I know that can be recreated in these people, which means I get validated, but also they get to get better. Like, they actually get to improve their lives. And there is a real power to that idea. And that just brings me a lot of satisfaction.
Because we also had our coaching programs, and they were several $1,000, and the investment that you make, you really want to get a lot out of it, and you build this strong community about people that really care. Almost, it's like a screen for like, who really cares, who really wants to be the best that they can. And I think that's so critical, because now you have everyone's, like, unlike maybe high school where you get kids not doing their homework, now everyone's doing it, everyone's committed. Like you with Rite of Passage, you started talking to Brandon. I think you had little writing groups that you get on, just type together. Like, I think that's amazing. And most online courses fail to do that. But that's why I think it's excellent that you've had the experience, because now you can have the breakout rooms, have the different community aspects in your own program that most people couldn't.
Yeah, I had to pull up my phone so I got this quote right. And I don't like pulling up phones on this, but Tiago said something the other day in Building a Second Brain, and I thought it was spot on. And it is, the price of something should reflect the effort it takes to benefit from it.
Oh, that's cool. It took me like 5 seconds to process, but
which is why this is the price is, it's for a first cohort at $2,000. A lot of people maybe say that's too much. I get that. It's not going to hurt my feelings. I will say this, that price is not going to be $2,000 for cohort 2. It's going to be higher than that, but that'll be because we've already run a cohort and we kind of have any kinks, taken care of at that point. But there's something to be said for, it needs to be a high enough price point where people do put in the effort, where they show up to class every time. Because like I said, I want to use breakout rooms to give people real practice. Well, if the course is $500, people aren't going to be incentivized to show up and they're going to miss, which means now they're not getting the value out of it, which means they're going to walk out of here saying that course wasn't worth it. But if the value all of a sudden goes up to $2,000 and they say, man, I got to show up. Like I spent some real money here. Now all of a sudden they're going to every breakout session and they're making those connections and they're building relationships with those people and improving their speaking ability. And they've now connected where in the future, when a job opportunity comes up, one of those people in that original cohort says, I know somebody who kind of does this and they're a pretty good speaker too. They took this course, like I know how they present. And now all of a sudden a job opportunity opens up or friendship opens up, or you start building something together. You decide, hey, there's a course that I could do now that I'm comfortable speaking in front of people. I could teach something, which means now all of a sudden you can reach out and say, hey, you were pretty good on this too. You want to help out and join together? There's so many benefits that come from it, but it has to be at a price point that really makes people buy in. And I feel like anything really below that threshold of $2,000 just doesn't do it. Now, again, I understand there are financial hardships on some people. And so those people can certainly reach out to me and ask if there's any sort of way that we can find a way to make some sort of different arrangement. And I'm certainly open to that idea because I don't want people missing out on it just because they don't make enough money. But I do think there's a value in making it hurt a little bit so that you actually put in the time and effort. I mean, it's the same idea of if you're an athlete, and when I was an athlete, I wanted to squat 405 pounds. That was just a goal I had. That's four 45-pound plates, I think, on each side. Yeah, because 315 is 3. I wanted that. That was my goal, which was a tough goal to get to. And that meant in order to get there, I had to sacrifice certain things. I had to take certain steps in order to achieve that. That meant I had to eat enough so that I put on enough weight to actually be able to put that sort of weight on my back. That meant I had to take care of my body so that my knees weren't breaking down, my ankles weren't breaking down. I had good mobility, so I'm spending time doing that. I had to make sure I'm sleeping enough and doing ice baths and cryotherapy and these sort of things so I can actually get there, which means there is an investment for me to get to that goal of 405 pounds. And it took plenty of time. And ultimately, I did get there. And when I hit that, it felt great. And then I immediately bumped up the goal and said, now I've got to do more. And so I think there's always a price to be paid for something. We just don't necessarily realize it. And making sure that it's a price that we are invested in ensures that we have a greater chance of achieving success for that goal.
Yeah, that's goes back. It's I guess a different way of approaching it, but with the SEALs, with that podcast, Jocko Pocket podcast I mentioned earlier, like they have their hell week, and that's essentially just trying to make it like once you get beyond that, you're with people that really care. I'd be fascinated to see, because my favorite class in college was persuasive communication, and now I'm still in contact with the professor, and I mean she's just been the best person ever, and I loved it because it was such an open room where you could give feedback, honest feedback, in a way that most people are afraid to normally. But I'm curious, maybe you'll have some tips for her that we can talk about later, and we can forward it or connect you to. But she's amazing. With this is actually, I don't know if you know Avtar Suratan. He's on Twitter, but he also went through Rite of Passage, and I think knew of you. But he wanted to ask, with Zoom calls, like, do you have any quick tips that you'd give for people in general, rather than what you'd do in person, as we're coming to I guess a close pretty soon?
Sure. So big thing is obviously sound quality is going to matter and lighting quality matters. Those are your two biggest things, right? Because just like in person, we show up looking a certain way. That's your first impression. So I will say for Zoom, you always need to make sure your audio quality is good and always make sure your lighting quality is good. It doesn't take a whole lot to make those things a whole lot better. You can buy ring lights that are fairly inexpensive. put behind your screen, and all of a sudden you look a whole lot better. You can get pretty cheap like lapel mics that are, $15 or so, and your sound quality goes up exponentially. Those are very simple things. Now, what else can you do? Don't have a second screen on. Put your phone away. Pay attention. Wherever your camera is, a lot of people put like a camera way, way up high. And so when they're looking at the camera, they're doing this. And then when they're looking down at their screen, the camera is like looking at the top of their head, right? Be aware of where your camera is located. Like my camera is just above kind of my screen, so that when I'm looking at the camera, it still feels like I'm pretty much connected to the computer or the screen. And when I'm looking at you, it still feels like I'm connected and I can see kind of what's going on. Those are simple things to use. The other thing too is I like to make sure a lot of people will get too close where you can't see kind of their shoulders and a little bit of their upper body. The reason I like that is able to demonstrate a level of warmth and presence when you're talking. So if you're just seeing kind of from the head up, it's really hard to gauge body language. Now, is this perfect? No. Like I don't love that it's only kind of here up, but I do think that that's the most effective way of presenting on Zoom, because I think if you start getting too far back, it looks like you're way too far removed from your camera. Then you can start doing things simply just even like I'm moving my hands below the screen so you can't see them, but you can see how my shoulders are moving. And I'm obviously using some sort of body language to do things. You can also do simple tricks, like you can actually lift your hands and start counting to make sure people are seeing things. You can also move, right? You can demonstrate. So a lot of times if you were speaking in a meeting, you might actually move to demonstrate when you're moving from one point to another point. You can do the same thing by just moving your body and saying, I started here and then I got here. It is a visual cue for your audience to start understanding you're changing topic or changing your focus. Same with the way I just go here to here, right? You can do these simple things in order to more effectively communicate. The other big thing too, be prepared to speak slow enough so people can understand what you're saying and speak clearly. Then pause and make sure that everyone is on the same page so you're not interrupting each other. Like there is nothing worse than speaking so fast that the other person hasn't finished their point just because they're thinking through something. So a lot of the things that work for general communication still work for Zoom. You just have to be a little bit more aware of some of these kind of dynamics where how do we demonstrate warmth and presence? That's a little bit more challenging. And that can just simply be the way you're seated, the way your body is positioned, right? Like a bad one is if I was sitting like this the entire time, all of a sudden I'm very cold. I have no presence. I'm not warm. Like this is not a good look. I'm here and now I feel like I'm engaged. Like I am talking to you. I'm interested in what's going on. It's a simple change of pace. So don't take it seriously. Like sit in a position like you would if you were in a meeting. You wouldn't lay back on your couch. You wouldn't recline and be laying down outside. Like you would be seated in a chair upright and showing people I'm paying attention. What you're saying matters.
I never thought about this until you said it, but being a little bit more dynamic is something that I would do on stage. Or you see someone on stage and you're like, you want to talk to this side of the room, kind of open your body to different sides and just be more dynamic, I guess. And that's something that I don't see a lot. And even myself, I'm thinking back to this podcast, I'm pretty much like this the whole time. But it is interesting observing that and all these little areas that are simple to correct, like even say the lighting or your posture or how the room is framed, that everyone can do and just instantly take the production quality, or it's basically like dressing up nicer or looking more presentable in person. If I were to ask you in terms of myself, what would you say you've noticed that I should work on? And this is just me being a little bit I guess selfish, but like, is there something with the way I communicate that you would tweak or change?
To be fair, you've done a pretty good job of asking questions and paying attention to what I'm saying, kind of leading in a natural flow, right? So I like that. There's probably the biggest thing that would immediately increase your communication skills would just be cutting out some of the verbal tics. I think lots of people have those where it's ums and likes and a little bit of rambling where maybe you aren't quite as confident in what you're asking as you should be. And sometimes we then want to frame it so a way that we almost, it's kind of that like self-deprecating humor, right? Or where somebody talks and says something and they laugh at the end of it, even though it's not a joke, because that's a way for them to kind of deal with that. And there was only like a few that really came out, where there were a couple times. And I think that's just, we're in a long conversation. Like, I'm sure I probably rambled at times too. It happens. But I think for you, I mean, you speak clearly and you're not trying to show off and use super big words. Like, you're speaking in a conversational tone. You speak at a reasonable pace. Lots of good things there. But I think the biggest thing would just be to continue to work on kind of those verbal tics and verbal crutch words that we all have. And instead of rushing to say those, just be okay in silence instead. So most of the time when we're filling the space and saying ums or uhs or likes, it's because we're trying to give our brain a minute to catch up and figure out, what am I going to say next? And so we fill that space with a word instead of just leaving it as silence. But if you leave it as silence, what is the difference between leaving it as silence and saying Whereas the only thing your audience is going to pick up on is the instead of just silence. They're not going to remember the silence. They're going to remember the ums. People will start counting them. So just so you know, I have like this little thing, right? It's literally a little clicker, which I use for all of my students at law school. Anytime they say or start a question with and, or end a question with so, they get a click, because that is not an appropriate way to use those words. Lots of people end their questions or their statements with just these, they just trail off. They end up saying some statement and then ending it with so, and they just leave it there. Like, that's not an ending. The same with and is not a start to your sentence most time. Every now and then when you're writing, it can work, but for the most part, you don't need to follow up the question with and, right? What happens is people will say, well, tell me more about that. And then what happened? Except you don't need the and. You can just say, then what happened, right? It's just a filler word that we are throwing in there to try to make ourselves a little bit more comfortable, even though we don't need to.
I'm sure you've generationally, maybe I'm only 23, so I haven't seen too much of I just don't hear older people saying like and anyone my age is abusing it like crazy. I start my sentences often, or just don't end with finality, and I'll say, and so, and like, I'll just continue with that. No, there's an now I'm hyper conscious of everything, but man, I'm not going to be able to think anymore. But basically, when you're conscious, I'll try and pull up the book quickly, see if I can. But I was just reading a book about similar topics, and it was saying how, let me see, I'll mention it later in the show notes. But basically, it's saying how like all these people say like, as I just did, and it's difficult to hear yourself most of the time. But if you have a counter for other people per se, you just pay more attention to when other people say it. Now you're naturally going to be infuriated when you hear it. So you'll cut it out, be more conscious of it yourself. Is that one tip that you'd give, or what other tips might you give people?
Yeah, one is just slow down when you speak. That's the easiest way. And this isn't necessarily for you, it's just in general. Speak slower, and you can self-edit as you go and think ahead as you go, because you're speaking at a more comfortable pace. The other is, well, I mean, you obviously record these, so you can watch them back and start realizing, hey, I'm doing this, and almost self-evaluating yourself, where you can figure out, what do I need to fix? What do I need to work on? So I'm always a proponent of videoing yourself or recording yourself speaking, so you can actually play it back and watch it and say, oh, that is not how I want to sound. And let's be clear, I still will say certain verbal tics or crutch words. It is just a part of how we speak. But you can try to really limit them where it doesn't become distracting. That's really the difference, is you don't want it to become distracting. When people start noticing that you're saying it a lot, it is taking away from your message. When you say it a few times, nobody pays any attention to that. That's really the difference. This isn't to say you can't ever use those words. It's going to happen. But you don't want to use them where people start counting. They're like, they said the word 30 times in that speech. I started counting because it was so absurd. And I can't tell you how many times that has happened in trials where I've seen other attorneys doing that. People will start counting and tell me exactly how many ands or likes or uhs, but whatever it may be that people are using. And it just becomes comical because that's all they paid attention to in the speaking. So that's really what we're trying to cut out. And the other thing too is, I told you I have that little clicker. You can have somebody just essentially do those things to you where I'm telling you, I will now have students who I can see their brain wanting to say those words because they will take that gasp of air and kind of start and they will catch themselves and stop it and then just cut it out and say the next word like they were supposed to. So they're now conscious of it, which will be the same for you. And you will start automatically pulling those things out because you don't want to say them. Again, sometimes they're going to come in because that's just the nature of speaking. Sometimes they come in with me. And especially when you're in a more casual conversation, if you're talking with friends and things of that nature, yeah, throw in your normal everyday conversational words that just let it flow, have some fun. It doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be perfect. But for more professional settings or for more, public facing settings, or even just instances where you want to show, hey, I've got a real mastery of how to speak well, you can demonstrate that when you're aware of it and trying to do that skill, you have a real grasp of it.
I think I'm trying to think of the exact quote, but it was something along the lines of with people in public speaking, when they just have the message there, but they can't convey it in the right way, or you have something like and that you say a lot that detracts from your message. And that's the worst thing in the world because now all your insights, all your knowledge just can't get out there effectively. So it's, if anything, sad. This is my last, I guess, semi-selfish question, but with building trust and comfort, you did it with all your 100+ jury trials. Do you have any ways of going about building that? I guess in a digital environment is a little bit different, but what are your go-tos for having a jury start to believe you and say, Robbie, I trust what you're saying to me?
Well, for me, when I'm talking to a jury is going to be different from how most other people can do it. But I think there's a great way to build credibility by telling stories. And so you'll hear me, I don't like to come up to people and say, I've tried 102 jury trials. That's why you should believe me. Nobody cares. That's not, maybe people care. I don't know. Maybe it sounds cool. Maybe it doesn't, whatever. I don't like framing it that way. When I hear people saying stuff like that, I immediately turn off and say they're just trying to be braggadocious, and I have no time for that. What I like to do is tell stories of some of the trials maybe I've had and just tell it and weave it within that, right? So I was a child abuse prosecutor for a year, and when I'm in this world, I'm trying all these cases, and I can basically tie in all the other experience I had, because in order to be a child abuse prosecutor, you have to have enough experience before they'll put you into that role. So I can say, look, one of the requirements, like I became a child abuse prosecutor because I had finally met that threshold where I had 75 jury trials. And they said, you know what, Robbie, we can trust you on these cases, right? So that is a very easy way to tell a story or explain something without saying, I have 102 jury trials, so you should believe me. It's saying I was a specific child abuse prosecutor, or in that murder case, why was I able to figure all that stuff out in the middle of the case? And why did I ask certain questions of witnesses? And why did I frame certain ideas in the way that I did? Well, I drew on all the experience I had in the previous 100 trials that I've been in. That's how I came to these ideas and figured them all out. Well, now it's a very organic discussion where it's those 100 jury trials helped me formulate the strategy I used in that murder trial. So it fits into the storytelling narrative. It doesn't come across as I'm just giving you a list of my credentials. I'm telling you a story that's interesting that also takes into account those credentials as to why I was in the position that I was in. So I think that's an easy way to connect and for me, make a jury believe me. And I try to do the same thing when I talk to people about performative speaking and public speaking is, again, I'll talk a lot about, hey, I had this student who had this problem and here's what went on. And I was able to help them because I had seen this when I was trying all these cases as a prosecutor. And so then I saw kind of the effect that it could have on them, which meant they were able to get better. And you can tell stories again to say these are my credentials without just hitting people in the face, right? It's kind of this idea of talking with people instead of talking at people.
Yeah, man, I love the idea of stories, and all of your blog posts for the most part, or the majority of them, start with some sort of story, and you can see you've honed the craft there. And that's just one of the fundamentals of human psychology. We love stories. That's what makes us buy in. And then you can back it up with, oh, I've done 100+ trials, or this is why my experience is so credible, in a way that sinks or sets in better. Robbie, is there anything, I mean, this has been eye-opening for me. I'm excited for everyone in your course. I honestly want to join it after talking for so long about all this stuff. Anything that we missed that you want to cover right now, or have we hit most of the bases?
Man, I'm sure we probably missed stuff, but I'm sure there's plenty of stuff for everybody to listen to. And if anybody wants to talk more, I'm always available. They can talk to me. They can talk to other people who are taking the course. They can ask me any questions. I mean, that's how we met, Dylan, is you just were asking me some questions, both in comments and DMs. And I'm happy to help people and try to give as much value as I can, just to really make a positive impact on people so they can develop into the public speaker and the communicator, because I also like to talk a lot about active listening and those kinds of skills. And also, if anyone wants to just talk random pop culture or movies or West Wing, I'm always down for that too. And that's probably the best move at this point, is just reach out to me if people want to talk more. And I'm always happy to swing back by and do a part 2 if you have more questions, Dylan, and we can just keep it on rolling.
I definitely will. That's a dangerous offer right there. So we'll have to watch out. But performative speaking, I think that's a cool approach. I'm excited to use it. I do have to watch West Wing, see if it connects as much. I tried it in high school, I believe, and didn't give it enough of a chance. But thanks again, Robbie. We'll leave everyone and their contact info, Robbie Crab, on Twitter if they want to reach out to you directly. I appreciate your time.
It's crazy. It really is. Like, I mean, you said about me going all in on Twitter. In June, I was at 180 followers. I think I'm nearing 4,200 right now. Like,
damn, 3 months ago, I guess. How about 4? That's. I mean, you're just putting out content, replying. That's what's amazing about you, more than probably anyone else on my Twitter feed. You just be so responsive, so willing to chat like this. So it's just a blast, man. Does it? I know you. Sorry to go so long, but does it like? Are you at the point where it's taken over your life a little bit in terms of like you think you're spending too much time on Twitter? Because I've played with this. I'm like, how much time do I want to put into this? Am I going to get addicted?
So I think there's a point where you have to invest it. I think there's 2 ways of doing it. You can either grow really slow and it takes a long time, or you can really just push it and grow it really quickly. And once you start growing, what you find is it really is a rigged game, where I can post things now and they get a lot more traction just because I have a big following. And so it's not just that more people like my stuff and will retweet and things like that, but when people see it, they think that it means more because I have a lot more followers. So once that happens, you start attracting more followers and you start growing, which means I have a bigger audience to reach. So when I'm talking about performative speaking now, I have 4,000 people who immediately see it versus 200. Well, that's a big difference. Brandon posted a thread today and it immediately sold. Somebody signed up for the course.
Really?
So, I mean, those types of things where you're like, if you have a big enough audience and can reach enough people, you all of a sudden have this, I only have to hit 1% of 4,000 people to get pretty good results. If I hit 1% of 200 people, those results aren't so good. And I think that's why I went all in. So do I feel addicted? No. Do I spend more time on it than I would like right now? Yes. But that is by design so that I can grow it fast. And then once it probably hits 10K, I could really back off and just say it can just run its own. Like then I can start doing what David does, which is block out times that I post and then respond, but not constantly throughout the day.